Hey, it's me, your RedTube dad. Let's go on a journey through transgender history. Now you might be thinking, hey, aren't trans people a new thing? Haven't they only recently started becoming more accepted in society? Well, my friend, let me tell you, as long as there has been gender, there have been people who felt like the one assigned to them just didn't fit. But I'm not going to sugarcoat it. There's no denying that trans history has a fair amount of discrimination, suppression, and cruelty. You see, gender has always been a powerful tool for social control, and those who resist it often make those in power feel uncomfortable. But that's exactly why I want to tell this story. To make it clear that trans people have always been a part of the human story, and that their rights are just as valid and important as anyone else's. So sit back, relax, get some tea, and let old man Tristan learn you some trans history. Trust me, you're not going to want to miss it. Oh, one quick note. This video discusses the history of trans people and includes mentions of violence, discrimination, sexual assault, and stigma experienced by trans individuals. In the case of people in history where the final verdict on their gender is not apparent, I opted to use they, them pronouns, but some historical quotes may misgender them. Viewer discretion is advised. So let's start where a lot of online debates end, by defining terms. Gender. Everyone's favorite topic of debate. Let's start by clearing up any confusion about the difference between gender and sex. The thing is, when it comes to sex, people like to make it seem like there are two distinct, easily definable categories, but that's not true. When it comes to biological sex, there's actually a lot of ambiguity, and it's not nearly as black and white as people make it out to be. Sex chromosomes, for example, are usually XX or XY, but there's a lot of variation within those categories. In fact, there are more people with non-standard sex chromosomes than there are redheads. Don't worry, there's a SciShow video that explains it all. Anyway, genes don't necessarily result in the physical developments we associate with sex. Those characteristics we break down into two categories, primary and secondary. Primary sexual characteristics are things like gonads, hormones, and internal and external sex organs. Again, with a lot of variation. It's the organs you have sex and reproduce with. You also have secondary sex characteristics, which, unless you're chasing people around with a 23andMe test or checking out people's organs,
wet-ass P-word,
will be the only thing that really determines sex you might see in public. Those are things like voice pitch, where hair is or isn't, breasts, hip ratios, what have you. I hate to sound like a broken record, but these also have a lot of variation of ways that they can present, and many can be altered with simple hormone replacement therapy. That paragraph just killed my monetization. Nebula.tv/stepback. Gender then is all the social stuff we've built up around these. Gender is how you act in public, how you dress, how you talk, what you talk about, whether you have opinions about bath bombs, that kind of stuff. It's a messy, complicated set of norms and expectations that's always in a state of flux. This is really outside the scope of this video, and I've talked about it before on this channel, but the quick and dirty is that gender is all the norms and expectations built up around our sex. Sex is something with a lot of gray area, and in our current society, we've made sex a clean and clear category artificially, then forced folks into two completely different modes of existing in the world based on where we assume they belong literally before they're born. Another important note for this video, as we go back, we're going to see many people who may fit a modern definition of trans, but might also challenge the category. The reason is because the way we engage with and organize around identity has changed a lot over the years. Furthermore, as I mentioned, gender has had its role in society change drastically over what you'll see as literal thousands of years of time. So when talking about trans people thousands of years ago, the definitions might be a little bit more gray as to what gender was, what one's identity was, and how gender functioned. Okay, now that I've finally got all those things out of the way, we can now do some honest-to-God trans history. Let's go! Oh, let's take a trip back in time in my blue time travel machine that isn't from any copyrighted work. We're going to go back into ancient history. Here we find thousands of years ago, before the written word even, evidence of trans people. In the Neolithic and Bronze Age Mediterranean, archaeologists found these drawings and figurines of a, quote, third sex, figures with female breasts and male genitals or no sex characteristics at all. These figures were often found in different settings depending on the culture. In Neolithic Italy, for example, female images were found in domestic settings while dual-sexed or non-gendered figures were found in burials or religious settings. In Neolithic Greece and Cyprus, a similar pattern was observed. But it's not just figurines that show evidence of trans people in ancient cultures. In the Czech Republic, archaeologists uncovered a nearly 5,000-year-old male skeleton wearing clothing typically reserved for women. This body, as well as these depictions in art, lead some experts to believe this could be the remnants of a trans woman, that or these societies had a distinct third gender. I just want to let you know that this means the first possible evidence of a trans person lived while there were still mammoths alive. This first trans person lived around the time of the invention of the written word. And the ancient Greeks had their own mention of trans people too. The Greek physician Hippocrates wrote about a group called the Inarai, who were androgynous Scythian priests and healers who, quote, performed female work and spoke like women. They were also mentioned by Herodotus as having, quote, female sickness, which was seen as a punishment from the gods and passed down through posterity. Oh, that has to be the most ancient Greek way of explaining trans people I've ever read. Scythians were like West Asian/Ukrainian nomadic horse warriors who were so good at horse riding they might have inspired the centaur. So let's just add that to our image. These very normal Greek philosophers in utter terror of mounted trans women warriors burning down their villages and stealing their feta cheese or whatever. Now, let's fast forward a few more centuries to the Roman Empire, where we find more examples. We have some interesting accounts from Philo of Alexandria and Marcus Manilius, both Roman writers. Both describe transgender people in their writings. Expending every possible care on their outward adornment, they are not ashamed even to employ every device to change artificially their nature as men into women. Philo even wrote about some members of this group having their penises removed. That's a long time before any painkillers, by the way. We also have accounts of trans-like figures in the year 98, when Tacitus wrote about the priests of a Swabian sub-tribe who dressed as women to perform their priestly duties. And let's not forget about the Roman Emperor Nero, who married a woman named Sabina, who was born Sporus. Reportedly, she wore her hair and dressed like a Roman woman. Nero even offered lots of money and honors to anyone who could help Sabina transition. Now, there are theories that Sabina was maybe fictional, or that Nero only married her because she looked like his previous wife, who he kicked to death. Emperor Nero wasn't a good guy, y'all. But nonetheless, this could be an example of a classical age, antiquity trans woman. A few hundred years later, you have what might be a trans Roman emperor. Again, this is a spicy one, and Mia Mulder talked about the case quite a bit in her video here. We're talking about Emperor Elagabalus. According to Roman historian Cassius Dio, Elagabalus delighted in being called the mistress, wife, and queen of Heracles, one of Elagabalus's lovers. The emperor wore makeup and wigs, preferred to be called a lady, and even offered huge sums of money to any doctor who could give her a vagina.
Wet-ass P-word.
Some historians see Elagabalus as an early transgender figure and one of the first recorded individuals seeking sex reassignment surgery. This is the 3rd century. Rounding out our tour of the Roman Empire, finally we can talk about Byzantine courtier Anastasia the Patrician. Anastasia left life as a lady-in-waiting in the court of Justinian I in Constantinople, possibly because he came on to Anastasia and that made Empress Theodora jealous. Their next career move? They moved to Egypt, and with the help of a monk, lived as a hermit for 28 years. The reason this is significant is because they wore men's clothing, and at this time, acting like a hermit in this fashion was only allowed for men. Anastasia has been adopted as a trans saint, which might be a misnomer, but they were part of an interesting trend of people escaping their lives as women to live as men as religious hermits, sometimes even without anyone finding out until after their deaths. Many of these people, despite the Bible being against cross-dressing, have become sanctified, literal saints. While I'm sure there's a lot of complex gender stuff going on, doing one quick search shows a lot of trans people claiming Anastasia and many of these saints as their own. especially for trans Christians. As we continue our journey through trans history, let's take a look at the medieval period. During this time, we see numerous examples of individuals living and presenting as a gender different from the one assigned to them at birth. Let's start in 1322 with Kalonymus ben Kalonymus, a Jewish philosopher and poet who wrote a poem called Even Bohan. The poem is very clearly about the experience of discontent with being assigned male at birth and a desire for the life of a woman.
Oh, but had the artisan who made me create me instead a worthy woman. Today, I would be wise and insightful. We would weave, my friends and I, and in the moonlight spin our yarn and tell our stories to one another from dusk till midnight. We tell of the events of our day, silly things, matters of no consequence. And when I was ready and the time was right, an excellent youth, husband, would be my fortune. He would love me, place me on a pedestal, dress me in jewels of gold, earrings, bracelets, necklaces, and on the appointed day, in the season of joy when brides are wed, for 7 days with the boy increase my delight and gladness.
For a long time, this poem was seen as a work of satire, but more recent interpretations seem to think otherwise. It lacks a lot of the comedic aspects of what a satirical poem might have, and reads a lot more as a painful longing for a different identity, a sense all too familiar to many trans people, often called gender dysphoria. The poem is actually pretty good, so I'm going to drop a link in the description. You can read the whole thing. Another interesting case is that of Rolandino Roncaglia, who was tried for sodomy in 1347, causing a sensation in Italy. After their wife died of the plague, after a celibate life devoid of feelings of sexual attraction, Rolandino started to prostitute themselves, wearing female dresses because, quote, he has a female look, voice and movements, although he does not have a female orifice, but has a male member and testicles. Many persons considered him to be a woman because of his appearance. In 1542, Alvaro Núñez Cabeza de Vaca documented same-sex marriages and men, quote, who dress like women and perform the office of women, but use the bow and carry big loads, among a Native American tribe, in his publication, The Journey of Alvaro Núñez Cabeza de Vaca and His Companions from Florida to the Pacific, 1528 to 1536. Not the greatest SEO, buddy. A small glimpse into a wide variety of gender expressions Native Americans practiced and still practice to this day. We also have this really strange case in 1629. A court in the British colony of Jamestown, Virginia, ordered Thomas or Thomasine Hall to wear a combination of male and female attire. This strange judgment was the result of a series of incidents that led to Hall submitting to a physical examination. The court, after seeing the results, determined that Hall had a, quote, dual-nature gender. It's likely that Hall was intersex. This shows, though, a lot more fluidity in gender compared to not long ago when someone born intersex would be surgically altered and forced to perform a gender based on what they decided the baby should be, with many dire consequences. Another interesting possible example of a non-binary person from colonial America is the famous Public Universal Friend. A preacher in New England claims they died and gave themselves the unique name. They preferred non-gender pronouns and resisted being classified as male or female. The case of the Public Universal Friend is so captivating, I really want to make them their own video someday. In fact, I think a few years ago I might have promised Lumiru that they'd voice that character. I guess I never got around to it because I'm not a great Public Universal Friend. Just a year later in France, we'd have another example of an androgynous figure who would become legendary. The Chevalier d'Eon, whose gender was defined as disputed, and the French used them to assume different identities as a spy. We also have the strange case of Jens Andersen in Norway, who appeared to be an assigned at female birth trans man. He got legally married in a church to a woman named Anne-Christine Mortensdottir, which wound up with him going on trial. When asked to define his gender, he responded,
Han tror att kunde hänhöra till bägge delar.
He believes he belongs to both. All right, we're out of EU4 and getting into Victoria 3 now. Let's talk about Frances Thompson. She was a trans woman who was born a slave in Alabama and eventually won her freedom in her 20s. She was then present at the Memphis Massacre of 1866 in Tennessee. It was essentially one of the many acts of racist political violence on black people in the South in the turbulent years after the Civil War, as white supremacists regained political control of the former Confederate States. During this, she was a victim of a horrible sexual assault. During a congressional inquiry into the massacre, Thompson testified as to what she endured. She knew this would put her in crosshairs, but she spoke out to the violence and injustice she experienced anyway. She was arrested for cross-dressing, and conservatives used that to essentially invalidate her rape testimony, because conservatives really don't change. She was sentenced to a brutal chain gang, and soon after release died tragically of dysentery. Thompson's one of the stories of the work of black women to reclaim their bodies after the injustice of slavery when they were literally property of their cruel masters and often victims of sexual assault at their hands. She testified before Congress at a time when the idea of a black woman having the ability to legally accuse a white man of sexual assault was unheard of. She lived her truth in the 1860s, and that is a level of bravery few could muster. Moving to India, the Hijra were defined by the colonial authorities of the British Raj as a, quote, criminal tribe, alongside various other social groups following the enactment of the Criminal Tribes Act in 1871. This imposed state surveillance and restrictions on the free movement of Hijra. Hijra is a term used in South Asia to refer to individuals who identify as trans if they're assigned male at birth, or as a sort of third gender. Hijra have a long cultural history in South Asian societies, dating back to ancient India. They're often referred to as eunuchs in historical texts, although many modern Hijras do not undergo castration. Hijras are considered a distinct community with their own customs, traditions, and cultural practices. They may also form their own social and familial structures, and may perform specific roles in religious ceremonies and rituals. Despite their cultural and historical significance, Hijras in South Asia often face significant discrimination and marginalization, and may have limited access to education, employment, and importantly for trans people, healthcare. I talked all about them in my video on the gender binary, which came out a few years ago. It's honestly the best thing to watch right after this, so look in the description or something, and it'll be there. However, not was all dark and gloomy. The 19th century also saw the formation of the Cercle Hermaphroditos, the earliest known transgender organization in the United States, which was reportedly founded in 1895 according to the writer and LGBT activist Jenny June. The organization had the goal of fighting the persecution of the period. This marked an important moment in the history of transgender people organizing and advocating for their rights. Though it's important to mention that evidence for this organization's existence isn't where we'd like it to be. The only real mention of it is in the biography of June herself, and she mentions that they used pseudonyms with each other, so no other link to a real person can be made. Furthermore, none of their literature exists today. Not to say the circle never existed, but that the historiography is still murky, and whether it was a real organization or a hopeful wish for a social justice group for trans people in the 19th century is still up for debate. As we move into the more modern period, though, the experiences of trans people would become more clear. Civil rights movements, scientific breakthroughs in transition, and a greater social awareness would start to simmer and grow as we approach the new millennium. The 20th century set off with a bang that would set a massive transformation in store for trans people. In 1906, Carl M. Baer became the first transgender person to undergo sex reassignment surgery. He came out as a trans man in 1904, and after receiving the surgery, got legal recognition with a male birth certificate the next year. He also wrote memoirs to his experiences of gender dysphoria, being assigned female at birth. Unfortunately, as we'll learn about a little bit later, the records and documents of his profoundly earth-shattering procedure are lost. In the early 20th century, we also saw the beginnings of the academic attempt to understand gender and the trans experience. Some people, like sexologist Havelock Ellis, theorized it as a form of extreme homosexuality, which is very incorrect, but where things got really interesting was through the work of a man by the name of Magnus Hirschfeld. Now,
Whoa. You're gonna talk about my guy, my boy, my good time soldier, my friend, Magnus Hirschfeld, without including me? Absolutely the fuck not. Sorry, Tristan, I'm taking the fuck over now. If you're gonna talk about trans people in the 1900s, you really gotta mention Magnus Hirschfeld and his Institute of Sexual Science. Magnus built on previous ideas around homosexuality, that were based on sexual inversion, the theory that gay people were, on some level, the other gender, and they got their sexualities mixed up. Except that he noticed that some people were exhibiting as the other gender, but weren't what they would perceive as gay. As in, a person could be born a man, live life as a woman, and still be attracted to other women. And this is not something that works within the sexual inversion theory. In the sexual inversion theory, that person should be attracted to men because they think they're a woman. But to them, sexuality wasn't the issue. Gender was. And while this went against the idea of sexual inversion, Magnus builds upon this to discuss gender expression and gender identity. And Magnus wants to differentiate this specific phenomenon, which he labels transvestites, meaning people who dress like the other gender. And he is actually the one who coins the term transvestite. And this is a step in the right direction. But Magnus notices that not everyone who cross-dresses, for lack of a better term, does it for the same reason. Some people do have gender going on, wanting to live life as a certain gender. Some people just want to dress up and have a good time. They like the clothes that they wear, and they don't want to be limited by gender norms around clothing. And, some people have a kink. But crucially, some people felt that living life as their chosen gender made them feel happier. And he called this specifically transsexualismus, or transsexualism. Now, all of this work, and much, much more work, was done at the Institute of Sexual Science that Hirschfeld ran in Berlin in the early 1900s. There he studied gender studies, LGBT studies in general, homosexual studies. He innovated in trans surgeries. He performed homosexual activism. For example, he did a lot of work trying to get homosexuality decriminalized in Germany. And he also studied the concept of non-binary gender identities. In fact, Magnus described a variety of gender identities, between which there are no empty points present, but rather unbroken connecting lines, basically claiming in the early 1920s that gender is a spectrum. However, this is Germany in the early 1900s, and you already know where this is going. Already in 1921, he was assaulted by far-right militias in the streets for his prominent status as a gay activist. And in the early 1930s, he was forced into exile into Switzerland, after a lot of far-right magazines were using him as the example of degenerate Jewish science. The institute, however, remained, headed now by his partner Karl Geist. But in 1933, the Nazis gained political power in Germany. And in May of that year, a bunch of students, followed by members of the SA, raid the institute, taking papers, documents, scientific studies, and many, many more documents. And a few days later, take them to a book-burning event, where they also parade a bust of Hirschfeld through the streets and later throw it into a big bonfire. Hirschfeld never returned to Germany, and after settling in southern France, he died in 1935. He would, at the time of his death and many years after, be used by the Nazi propaganda machine as an example of un-Germanness, and an example of degenerate Jewish sciences. During his lifetime, he made life better for hundreds of LGBT people. But, as is often the case in history, the Nazis come along and they fuck up everything.
Hey there, it's me in the editing booth for a moment. Just to add on to what Mia said, that after the Nazis' destruction of Hirschfeld's work, it would take a long time before research into the trans experience and into transition would start up again. And it would start to come back, but not until the mid to late 1940s after the war was over. So let's get into that. In this early period, we're seeing some experimentation and study into transition. A woman named Dora Richter became the first person to get a vaginoplasty, a major breakthrough in the development of trans healthcare. In 1946, the first female-to-male sex reassignment surgery happened in Britain to a man named Michael Dillon. However, these surgical interventions were sometimes overambitious and ended in tragedy. One of the most famous early cases of that is Lily Elba, who in 1930 received reassignment surgery that involved transplanting ovaries into her body. The next year, surgeons tried even further for a uterus transplant. Unfortunately, the technology for such transplants was not there yet, arguably it isn't there now, and her body's rejection of the organ killed her. On the legal front, in 1941, we saw the first successful legal name change for Barbara Wilcox to her chosen name to conform to her gender identity in Los Angeles. There you go, Angelinos. And soon we'd see an increase in visibility. In 1952, the same year transsexual was first printed in English, the world met Christine Jorgensen. She made international news when she became the first widely publicized person to have undergone sex reassignment surgery. A World War II veteran, she wrote a letter to her parents saying, quote,
"Nature made a mistake which I had corrected, and now I am your daughter."
It has been decades since these sort of surgeries had been done, and only in Germany at this point. It was a sort of rediscovery. The story made her an overnight celebrity, even taking the most attention from journalists when her plane landed in America, which she shared with the Danish royal family. She became a best-selling author, had a nightclub act, and appeared several times on TV and radio. She was one of the first faces and voices advocating to see trans people as the perfectly normal humans they are. Her story inspired a film called Glenn or Glenda. It starred Bela Lugosi, aka Dracula, and for a long time was considered the worst film ever made. But it has since become a bit of a cult classic. The same year the movie came out, the first major scientific report on using hormone therapy for trans women was released. Technology had existed for a few decades, but was the first major report of its use as a treatment for medical transition. But things would really start to change in 1959, where we'd see the beginnings of uprisings which would result in the modern LGBTQ+ movement. We usually time this to Stonewall, but it actually began in a donut shop in LA. In the Cooper Donuts riot, police tried to harass some LGBTQ folks in the titular 24-hour Skid Row coffee shop between two gay bars, one of the few safe places LGBTQ folks could exist in at this point. People resisted the arrests, throwing stuff at the cops, and drew out a huge crowd from the two neighboring bars. It led to an all-night clash between the queer community and the police, who tried just one time too many to oppress their people. It's considered the first LGBTQ uprising in the United States. And another 1966 uprising in San Francisco was specifically about the police harassment of drag queens and trans women. It was a period where the public was increasingly becoming aware of gender identity and the medical community becoming more established in providing trans healthcare. If it wasn't for anti-trans backlashes in the 1980s and 2020s, who knows where we'd be. Then there was the big one. 3 years later, the Stonewall riots in New York City marked a turning point in the fight for LGBTQ+ rights. This massive riot of the queer folks of New York against the police oppressors birthed what would become the gay rights movement. And often unsung is that a lot of trans women were at the forefront of this, including a very special woman named Marsha P. Johnson, who would go on to, along with Sylvia Rivera, found the Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, or STAR, the next year in 1970. This organization was dedicated to advocating for the right of transgender and gender non-conforming people, especially homeless people. And trans people suffer a very high rate of homelessness, mostly because they're kicked out by their parents. Isn't that lovely? I really started going down a rabbit hole about Marsha P. Johnson, and it started taking over this section of the video. I wanted to talk about her life as a visible and open activist for LGBTQ+ people, and her place as a figurehead to this day of the community and its history, but I also wanted to investigate the suspicious nature of her untimely 1992 death. That work started spinning into a whole video within a video and started weighing down this section, so I had to cut it. But I made the video anyway, and luckily there is a place where I don't have to hyper-streamline all my videos to maximize retention, and that place is Nebula. Yeah, that's right, it's Nebula time. Nebula has completely changed my life. It's a platform where creators like myself have come together to make what we want to make and what we feel needs to be made. No algorithm, no demonetization, just the idea that if it's good, we make it. A platform like YouTube, while I love the opportunity it gives me, has created a limited scope on what I can talk about while continuing to pay the bills. But now, I can have it both ways by putting it on Nebula. So not only will signing up to watch it get you all my back catalog ad-free, but bonus content from me and dozens of creators that I know you like. 2 celebrity guests that I had on this video, Mia Mulder and Jesse Gender, both are on Nebula, as well as Abigail Thorne's Philosophy Tube. Lindsay Ellis is back in the video essay game exclusively on Nebula, but this video is brought to you by a great partnership with the streaming platform CuriosityStream. They loved educational creators so much, they wanted to support making more of it, so we worked out a deal where if you sign up in the link below, you not only get access to CuriosityStream, but you get Nebula, where all that great stuff I mentioned earlier is there for free. That's not a trial. As long as you stay a member of CuriosityStream, you'll have Nebula. CuriosityStream has thousands of documentaries and nonfiction videos with big, shiny budgets. Do you want to hear Patrick Stewart talk about fusion power? Because I sure did.
It may be the greatest technological challenge ever undertaken by humankind. The quest to produce the ultimate energy solution. A reliable source of clean power.
So go to curiositystream.com/stepback or click the link in the description to sign up, and you'll get, hands down, the best deal in video streaming and really help out my channel and many others you know and love in the process. Okay, now let's get back to the content. In 1972, Sweden became the first country in the world to allow trans people to legally change their sex and provided free hormone therapy. Chile followed suit in 1974, allowing a trans woman to legally change her name and gender on her birth certificate after sex reassignment surgery. In 1975, Minneapolis became the first city in the United States to pass trans-inclusive civil rights protection legislation. That same year, Angela Morley became the first openly transgender person to be nominated for an Academy Award, while Conundrum by Jan Morris became the first widely sold autobiography published by a transgender woman. In 1976, Renee Richards made headlines as one of the first prominent transgender athletes in the United States when she competed in the US Open. The 1980s marked a time of significant organization for trans people. In 1980, the Human Rights Campaign, an LGBTQ+ advocacy group, founded and is to this day the US's largest LGBTQ+ civil rights organization. Furthermore, Lou Sullivan founded FTM International, which is the oldest organization in the US specifically for trans men. But it wasn't all good news in the 80s. In 1980, the gender identity disorder in children diagnosis was introduced in the DSM-3, which is a manual of psychological disorders. This led to some trans individuals being diagnosed with a mental disorder and being subjected to harmful and unnecessary treatments. It's also important to mention the 1980s was the beginning of the HIV pandemic and the AIDS crisis, which led to a conservative attack on all things LGBTQ+, and trans people were roped up in that as well. Though despite that, the 1990s was a time of growth and progress for the trans community, with a number of important milestones being reached. In 1992, Althea Garrison became the first trans state legislator in America, serving one term in the Massachusetts House of Representatives. The state of Minnesota also enacted anti-discrimination legislation based on gender identity in 1993. In 1998, Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays became the first national LGBTQ+ organization to adopt a trans-inclusive policy. Probably the most important event was the first Transgender Day of Remembrance in 1999. It was started by Gwendolyn Ann Smith as a way to memorialize the murder of Rita Hester. The outpouring of support to hold vigil for her and demand her respect be given by the press inspired people to this day. It's since become an international day of action and observed every November 20th. As the 20th century came to a close, the trans community continued to fight for recognition and equality. As we move into the 21st century, the trans community continues to face numerous challenges and discrimination. However, with the resilience and determination of trans activists, we have and can continue to make progress towards a world where all trans people are given the respect and dignity they deserve. So let's move into the 2000s. I guess the first iconic thing to talk about is that in 2000, at a pride parade in Phoenix, Arizona, the world saw the transgender pride flag fly for the first time. This symbol of trans pride is a staple now, so that's pretty cool. The first decade of the 2000s also saw some of the first trans representatives, including the first trans mayor. And just because I couldn't let this go by, the first transgender choir? The U.S. Congressional Subcommittee on Health, Employment, Labor, and Pensions held its first ever hearing on discrimination against trans people in the workplace. This marked an important step forwards, raising awareness and addressing the challenges that trans people face in their professional lives. In 2009, we saw the first of another important yearly event for the trans community, the International Transgender Day of Visibility. Transgender activist Rachel Crandall founded the day because the only trans-centric holiday was a day of mourning, and she wanted something to celebrate members of the community. And that continues to this day, every March 31st. Big year where everything exploded, though, was 2014. The U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission filed the first Title VII action by the federal government on behalf of trans workers. The lawsuits were filed for the work of trans women Amy Stevens and Brandy Branson. Also, Laverne Cox happened. She made headlines by gracing the cover of Time magazine and becoming the first openly transgender person to be nominated for an Emmy in the acting category for her role in Orange is the New Black. The name of her interview in the magazine? The Trans Tipping Point, which makes a lot of sense for this particular year. The UN Human Rights Council also adopted a second resolution related to sexual orientation and gender identity, making it the first time in the Council's history that it adopted a resolution on LGBTQ rights with a majority. For the record, this was a period where there were so many first trans acts happening in various fields of science, arts, sports, Venice gondoliers, and even homecoming kings and queens. I'd mention them all, but this video is already really long. In a wild bit of scientific progress, in February 2018, a transgender woman in the United States successfully breastfed her adopted baby, the first known case of a trans woman breastfeeding in history. But as we close in on the 2020s, the current backlash we find ourselves in really begins to grow. In 2019, the Trump administration announced that transgender people were no longer allowed to enlist in the US military. This trans military ban was met with widespread criticism and protest. In 2020, the Trump administration again passed a regulation removing protections for trans patients getting medical care. That same year, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development announced plans to revert an Obama-era ruling that prevented federally funded homeless shelters from discriminating against trans people. However, not all was doom and gloom. Also in 2020, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in favor of protecting employees from workplace discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity in the landmark case Bostock v. Clayton County. And one of President Biden's first moves was to repeal the military ban. And of course, in 2021, Elliot Page, a high-profile celebrity already, came out as trans, a much-needed W in the somewhat lacking area of prominent trans men representation. And that same month, President Joe Biden became the first American president to issue a formal presidential proclamation recognizing the Transgender Day of Visibility. You know, I'm no real big fan of Joe Biden, but a dub's a dub, right? But the dubs are getting further apart, it seems. This past year, we've seen an anti-trans moral panic sweep the world. One of the world's most famous authors, long thought to be an anti-trans bigot, J.K. Rowling, came full out in a bigoted hate campaign against trans people existing. In America, to gain points in the 2022 election, the conservative strategy seemed to be an all-out offensive on the concept of trans people's right to exist. It didn't seem to work as they liked, but after all the hard work and blood and tears, it seems that we're seeing trans rights to healthcare, to just exist start to slip away as this disgusting fascist backlash to the basic dignity of all humans festers. To trans people, despite all the work done, the world seems pretty scary. The language in the world invalidating what they know deep in their bones to be their truth. And that's why I made this video. I wanted to show that trans people are a deep and wonderful part of the human story. And so this section is for all the young trans people out there. Please know, you're not an ideology. You're not a trend. Transgender people have been part of humanity for as long as there has been a humanity. You have a rich history, and with all my deepest hopes, a bright future ahead of you. Times are scary. Fuck, they're downright terrifying. But please remember that you're not alone. There are people all around who care about you and support you. You are loved and valued, and you have the strength and resilience to face whatever comes your way. Never forget that you have the power to make a difference in the world. Your voice matters, and you have the ability to inspire and empower others. You're an important part of the human story, a crucial part of the human story, and we stand with you every step of the way. So keep going, keep fighting, never give up. Remember to take care of yourself and never hesitate to reach out for help when you need it. You are loved, valued, and supported. So believe in yourself and keep shining bright. We stand with you, and today, I celebrate you. So that was a lot. Why not continue learning and expanding your understanding of the trans community? There's a lot of trans creators on this platform. I also highly recommend watching my video, The Gender Binary is Not Normal, in this video, in a thing that you can click on. In the video, I dive into the concept of the gender binary and how it's not nearly as old or universal as people want you to think it is. So if you want the full picture and learn more about the trans experience, make sure to check it out. Trust me, you're not going to want to miss it.